Technology is everywhere, and so should a systematic philosophical reflection on technology. The Working Group on Philosophy of Technology, WGPT, at the University of Leuven in Belgium aims to create a platform to do precisely that. You're listening to WGPTalks, a series where we give the opportunity to our own members to talk about what fascinates them at the crossroads of technology and society. Today we talk with Tim Christiaens on the topic of platform capitalism. More likely than not, you have recently ordered food takeaway easy with your smartphone, or you're perhaps dreaming about your new vacation with an Airbnb somewhere in the summer. Remarkable new possibilities in what some have called platform capitalism. But what is this strange new form of capitalism? Today, we are joined by Tim Christiaens, who is a member of our working group and who recently defended his PhD in Leuven on Michel Foucault, Georgia Agamben, and their views and criticisms of the Homo economicus, and is now about to start his new position in Tilburg. And in more recent work, he has focused precisely on this concept of platform capitalism. So welcome, Tim. Can you explain to us what is platform capitalism?
Thank you for having me. And well, platform capitalism is, as a name, introduced by Nick Cernicek, a media theorist from the United Kingdom, in a book from 2017 called Platform Capitalism. And he argues that you can see that after the global recession from, let's say, around 15 years ago, that there's a shift in the major companies or kind of the economic power constellation in the world. So where the largest companies in, for instance, the 1990s or the early 2000s used to be energy companies or car manufacturers, or that now it's all big tech. And more specifically, one specific sector within this technology sector, namely platform companies. So these are companies that build a platform on the internet that connects users for a particular service. So social media, for instance, these are platforms where the technology or the software connects users to facilitate social relations. Or, for instance, ordering food. That's another platform where restaurants are connected to potential consumers. For instance, a company like Uber, you could say, well, it looks like a regular taxi business, because basically what it offers is cheap rides to people in cities. But what it actually does, or what it claims to do, is, well, the only thing we do is we connect independent contractors with a car to people looking for rides. So Uber, for instance, claims that they are not a taxi company. They offer a service, namely the service of connecting supply and demand on the market for urban transportation. So this is the kind of central idea of this platform capitalism, is that you have companies that build and curate online platforms to connect people for all kinds of different services. And so what they get their profits from is by taking a cut from every transaction conducted on that platform. And so taking the case of Uber, if I pay X amount of euros for a particular ride, then part of that fee will go to Uber as a service fee, and the rest I pay to the driver. So that's kind of the basic principle of how these platforms work. And so Cernicek's argument is that these digital platform companies are becoming the model or kind of the largest powerhouse in capitalism today.
And is the difference then in platform capitalism, in contrast to earlier forms, that these companies do not have employees anymore? That, as you said, they are each has their own company, each has their own independent contractor, whatever, instead of the classical idea of one boss and all the employees underneath him or her?
Well, you can say that platform companies are here taking to the extreme a trend that was already ongoing since the 1980s and 90s. What happened then was a kind of a revolution in business management, where they said, well, a company should only focus on what they call core competences. So only the things that specific company specializes in should be kept in-house. And all other jobs or all other tasks should be outsourced or offshored. So to give you an example, a company like Apple is one of the largest companies worldwide, but it only employs a very small fraction of workers. And actually the only workers who specifically work for Apple are their designers or their tech developers and marketing businesses. So basically what is Apple? It is a company that does the public relations for a range of products. That's what Apple does. And for instance, the production of iPhones or even the research and development for new technology, all of these things are outsourced to other companies. The advantage of that is that you can, as it were, downsize labor rights, which makes labor costs lower. So, for instance, if Apple would hire all people working or producing iPhones themselves, that would mean that you would have a very large workforce that would be able to collectively demand for social rights or for a particular pay rise. And if you would want to let people go, they would have to follow, for instance, American labor law. Whereas if they outsource all these businesses, then it's just a matter of not extending a contract anymore. So for instance, Apple has a contract with a company in China like Foxconn to produce a particular number of iPhones. But if there is no demand for that iPhone anymore on the market, or they won't be able to sell it, then they can just end the contract with Foxconn. And what Foxconn then does with the workers, whether they lay them off, or that's Foxconn's problem. But it's not Apple's problem anymore. So that's a way in which the major tech companies can rationalize their business. Now, what platform companies like Uber or Deliveroo are doing, they're pushing that to the extreme. So they would say a company like Uber is not in the business of taxi rides. So it outsources even the business of driving. So hence why you can have a transportation company that doesn't own any cars. Or the same for Airbnb. So what it promises is a way to find cheap rental apartments, rooms, or for holidays, but it doesn't actually own any real estate. So what Airbnb does in-house is its marketing operations and curating its platform, and all other stuff. So the actual on-the-ground work is outsourced to individuals who do this basically as an independent contractor. So just like Apple outsources to a company like Foxconn, you could say, well, an individual Airbnb host is a company that does outsourced business for Airbnb.
So I have the impression, although it hasn't been made explicit, that people who talk about platform capitalism are not a fan of platform capitalism. So the story is going towards the decrease of protection for workers and these kind of things. Whereas probably those in favor say that, look how easy it is, look how these new companies offer opportunities for people themselves to hire this one room they have, etc. in Airbnb, or they can become a kind of taxi driver, even though they do not own a taxi and these kind of things. But you seem to be very negative about this development. And I figure people who talk about platform capitalism in general are.
Yeah, indeed. So if you look up the literature in social sciences or critical theory or philosophy, it's predominantly negative. And I'm also saying more towards the negative side, but there are definite upsides to this. To give a few examples, the barriers of entry for workers are very low in these services, which means that there are lots of workers who would not be able to find jobs in traditional labor markets who can find jobs here. And so to give an example, to stay with the example of Uber, it's very easy for instance, migrants who don't speak the local language to start working for Uber. So barriers of entry are very low. Also, the problems that are being discussed, and also the ones that I'm talking about right now, are mostly problems experienced by people who rely on these platform businesses as their main source of income. And so, for instance, if you are in a university city with lots of students working as delivery people or working for Deliveroo or one of these companies, usually they don't experience all of these problems because for them, this is just a side job for some little extra money. So many of the problems do not really concern them because they're not dependent on these platforms for their day-to-day sustenance. So indeed, I mean, we should kind of relativize the criticisms or the problems that we are discussing. These only apply to a very particular group within this larger workforce. And even then, it's also important to realize that the platform economy is rather small still compared to the general labor market. So we're speaking about a more or less marginal phenomenon, but a marginal phenomenon that is paradigmatic for other businesses as well. Like I said, like they're basically taking to the extreme tendencies or trends that were already apparent in the general labor market. So it's a way of kind of seeing, well, you take the most extreme case of something to see also what's wrong in the general labor market.
So what then are the problems with these platform capitalists? You mentioned already a lessening of protection of workers, but are there other problems that we should be aware of?
Let's say a main problem, or at least one that I focus on mostly, is a thing that I call mental subsumption. It comes from the Marxist literature, where in Marx's Capital, he makes a distinction between formal and real subsumption of labor under capital. And the dichotomy is about the following. In formal subsumption, you have a particular labor process organized by workers themselves, and the end product is privatized by the capitalists. So this was about traditional manufacturers in the 18th century. What they would do is they would simply put workers who used to work at home, like together in one building, basically doing the same kind of work that they were already doing before, but now they're doing it for the capitalists. But the labor process itself remained unchanged. Then Marx says, well, through time, you see that capitalists use their profits to reorganize the labor process and make it more efficient. So then they start intervening in the labor process to coordinate it, to make it faster, to make it more productive, and in that way also to make even larger profits. And because if you can make your workers more productive, they produce more commodities in the same amount of time, and hence you can also sell these commodities and have higher profits. That was kind of Marx's analysis. But of course, he was talking about 19th century large-scale industry, factories. Whereas Marxists today say, well, if we're now moving to a kind of capitalism dominated by big tech, we'll have to see that the factories are not the major source of exploitation anymore. It's these platforms. And how? Well, because these companies make profits out of extracting data out of all the transactions that happen on these platforms. A simple example, a social media company like Facebook, how does it make money? It extracts data from our social media activity, analyzes that data, and then rents out advertisement space to companies to which it can then promise targeted advertisements. And so instead of hiring a billboard in the middle of a city where everyone can see, for instance, an ad for Coca-Cola, Facebook can say, well, we're only going to show this Coca-Cola advertisement to people who have a higher likelihood, given our knowledge about people's data, of actually buying Coca-Cola afterwards. So that's kind of the idea of the business model. But what it does is, of course, it modifies our social behavior, but no longer on the level of physical labor, like in these 19th century factories, but in our minds. And so all these platform companies, they hire psychologists to figure out how to make people produce more data on their platform. And so because the more data people produce, the more profits will eventually be gathered by these platform companies. And so our behavior has to be modified to make it, as it were, data proof, to make it legible to their algorithms. And so that means producing more information and also, remodeling our behavior in such a way that it can actually be relevant information for that company.
So since we are a philosophy of technology group, the question is then, is this simply a product of new technologies? The fact that we have our iPhones or smartphones, that we're all on Facebook, that allows this new form of platform capitalism to spread? Is it simply a matter of technology?
Well, with good old-fashioned philosophical words, we can say, well, it's a dialectic. In the sense that because these technologies reformat our social behavior, and that means our social behavior changes, and it also produces new expectations for new technologies. And to give one example, for instance, you can see on social media and on our communication that there is a trend toward acceleration. So it used to take a lot of time to communicate with each other. If you would send a letter through the post office, it took a few days to arrive at the person you were communicating with. And so you had to wait for, let's say, a week to get a response. What then digital technology allows us to do is to accelerate the communication process. So if you send an email, you don't have to wait a week for a response. You can get a response in 5 minutes. So it starts from, in this case, social expectations for acceleration. We need that for all kinds of things. But once that we have that technology, it also reformats our social expectations. So once we have a technology like email, we expect people to reply in a matter of minutes or a matter of hours. If we send an email and we only get a response a week later, we are offended. So this means that social expectations and the capacities of technological advancement work in a kind of dialectic. They can reinforce each other. So it's not the technology's fault, but we should realize that technology is always implemented within a specific society with specific conditionings, and it has an effect on those conditions as well.
So a dialectic leading to mental subsumption. Yeah. But how must we understand that specifically? In what way do these new platforms reshape our minds?
You have researchers like Geert Lovink in the Netherlands. They refer to what they call addiction by design. What they mean is that the way in which the apps on your smartphone are designed is to make sure that you get addicted to them. It sounds a bit dramatic, of course. I mean, it's not like you're on heroin or anything, but maybe to kind of get the feeling of what we're talking about, you can think about it like with this thought experiment. Imagine you get a message on your iPhone or your smartphone, and you put it away somewhere like within reach, without looking at where the message is coming from or what the message is. So you simply hear kind of the bleep of your smartphone. How long are you able to, say, not look at your screen? I guess, well, most people have experience with that, so it usually doesn't take very long. And that's the whole thing why push notifications, for instance, exist on smartphones. They're a way to make sure that people are engaged with social media or with other apps, and that once they're engaged, they keep being engaged. To stay with the example of social media on the smartphone, you can see with the way in which the interface is built is to make sure that you will actually engage with it. And so for instance, if you're not on one of these platforms for a while, you will get an email or through some kind of other kind of medium, you will get a message from Facebook asking what's the matter or what new kinds of things have happened on the platform while you were away. So you get a call to engagement. And once you respond to that, you're introduced to an interface that incentivizes you to keep going. So for instance, the scrolling down on social media is to make sure that you have the idea that an interesting message or an interesting post might be around just by scrolling a little bit more. And the scroll seems infinite, so you can go on and on and on. And hence why you see that if you ask people to time their social media activity, they always get it wrong. Also, when they predict, well, I'll only look at my phone for 2 minutes, usually it takes a lot longer than 2 minutes. And afterwards, they realize, well, what have I been doing with my time? And so afterwards, they realize, actually, I was bored and I wasn't doing anything. But while they were doing it, they were very engaged.
So the issue is then that this mental subsumption somehow threatens or free will would be a big word, or autonomy or of freedom to choose for ourselves what we do with our day. Is that then the issue?
Yeah, indeed. What these companies or these platforms do is they trick us into producing data that's valuable for those companies. And so they exploit our psychological biases. And so to give an example, lots of these platforms have digital reputation systems. So these are systems where we review each other, for instance, by rating each other with a number of stars. And so if you've been in an Airbnb, afterwards you will get an email or a message from Airbnb asking you to review your host. And the other way around as well, the host gets a chance to review you. And because people are almost naturally social pleasers, so we want to please others, or we want to be in some form of good standing with other people, we want to be recognized by others, we want to score high on these digital reputation systems. And so we'll put in an effort to be nice to people, not so much because we actually genuinely want to be nice to them, but because in the back of our minds, we're also thinking we want to get a good rating. And especially for these hosts who depend on their income from Airbnb, these reputation scorings are very important. And because if they are downgraded, they get a lower score on the platform and thus a lower likelihood to receive new guests. So it's very important for them to please their guests. So what you see here, then Airbnb is profiting from all this data that they're gathering through this reputation system. And it's using our, say, need for social gratification to push us into producing more data than we would as we're authentically or spontaneously want to produce.
I'm not sure whether I could ever look at my phone in the same way or book an Airbnb in the same way. I think it's clear what the problem is, but what will be a way out? And well, in recent texts, you have been using the work of Ivan Illich as a kind of way out. Who was Ivan Illich?
Yeah, so Ivan Illich was a Croatian-Austrian priest, or at least he was originally trained as a priest, who lived in the second half of the 20th century. At a certain moment, he went to the United States as a missionary, and he worked there with the Puerto Rican community in New York. And because he had such a good connection with Puerto Ricans, he eventually transferred to Latin America. He was based then in Puerto Rico, Mexico, and that's where he stayed most of his life. But in the 1960s, by the end of the 1960s, he had a fallout with the Vatican, with the Catholic Church, over the role of missionaries in Latin America. Because what he was seeing is that especially American missionaries would go to countries like Mexico or Brazil or Argentina, thinking that the United States had figured out how to do Catholicism, and they were basically exporting the North American model to these other countries where they only saw needy, underdeveloped Latin Americans. Whereas Illich's idea of mission was rather that, so the original apostles spread over the countries as ignorant people who adapted their message to these different cultures. So his idea was that that Latin American culture was self-sufficient, but that Catholicism had to find a new articulation in these other countries. Whereas what he saw in the kind of non-organized missions was basically exporting a model from the United States as if Latin Americans were simply underdeveloped. And so that was kind of how he shifted from critique of the Catholic Church to kind of more grander social critique. So in the 1970s then, Illich was very popular among leftist cultural critics as a writer of kind of popular essays with all forms of criticisms that people weren't used to hear. So in the 1970s, he produced a number of relatively small books where he criticized institutions that until then were considered beyond all forms of critique. And each time again, it was the same critique of developmentalism that was applied to different institutions. So institutions like the education system or hospitals and the medical apparatus, or also technology, specifically technology in the energy and transportation sectors. And so things like the car, like it was unimaginable in the 1950s or 60s that you would write a critique of the car. And so that's exactly what Illich did.
Yeah, probably his most famous book is Deschooling Society. What precisely is his problem with the school, with the educational system, and what does it have to do with the whole story about platform capitalism?
Basically, the critique of the schooling system, you can see that as a kind of paradigm for all his other critiques as well. So what he says there is that the schooling system has put itself in a situation of a radical monopoly, where it says a like traditional monopoly, that is, you have a particular market, and within that market, there is only one company that provides the supply of a particular commodity, and hence all consumers are dependent on that one supplier. So imagine the car sector where you would only have one manufacturer, Volvo or Volkswagen. That means that this one company can dupe consumers into higher prices, into substandard products, without these consumers having an alternative. And so a radical monopoly is a situation where not one specific company, but a sector acquires a monopoly over a particular sphere of social relations. And so Illich's argument about the education system ran like that. People were obliged to attend schools that are regulated and organized by the state with a predetermined curriculum. That means that there is basically only one form of education possible anymore. Now, there are definite advantages to that, and he sees these. So Illich does not want to abolish schools at all. But what he is saying is that because there is this only one monolithic system without any alternatives left, and that it creates counterproductive results. So you get the promise of generalized education, but this promise is never really fulfilled. And because of this radical monopoly, the only solutions imaginable to policymakers is more of the same. So if there's something wrong with the education system, or there's some kind of skill or knowledge that we think children should have, for instance, technology skills or financial skills, or every 10 years it's something else, what we immediately think about is, well, there should be a course in school for that. So the problem of lack of education is more schooling. And so Illich says, well, that produces also problems, because these schools are organized through, well, there's an explicit curriculum, what people need to study, but there's also a hidden curriculum, all kinds of implicit assumptions people have to accept in order to be able to continue in the schooling system. And if they don't, they become dropouts. So what happens is you basically institutionalize inequality. So to give a simple example, in school, only a particular form of kind of standardized language is considered proper language. And for middle class or upper class people, that's no problem, because it's their language that is considered the standard language. But for working class people who speak some form of dialect, or who have a particular accent, or for instance, migrants, or what they speak is not considered proper language. And so they have a diminished likelihood to be actually able to continue in the schooling system. So what is presented as generalized education is actually a system of institutionalized inequality.
And it's the idea then that the same can be applied to these platforms, that, for instance, Facebook has this radical monopoly on social relations, that we always have to communicate with our friends and family through these platforms, and that they also have this hidden curriculum then in how to behave socially. Indeed.
So you see that ideally a digital platform extracts all information from the social relation to which it caters. So, for instance, Facebook, it's communication with friends. For instance, a dating platform like Tinder, it's dating social relations. romantic social relations. With Uber, it's urban transportation. And so they have this one particular sector, as it were, in social relations, and they become more successful the more of this field that they are able to privatize. Imagine if Deliveroo would be able to have information in one particular city of what everyone is eating all of the time. It would be able to predict exactly, relatively accurately, what people or how much of a particular good or a particular form of food would be consumed on a particular day of the week, for instance. The more information it gathers, the more valuable these data become. And so the ideal situation for a digital platform is when it completely substitutes for that social activity. So for instance, with dating, for instance, it's good for Tinder if flirting in a regular cafe or in a bar becomes considered too invasive or improper. Because, I mean, if you want to date someone, there's Tinder for that. For Tinder, the ideal situation is when that social relation is completely transported to the platform. But that also means that we become dependent on that platform and how that platform kind of values us. And so that's where these inequalities come in.
So Illich shows once again what the problem is, but does he also have an alternative, a way out? What does he propose to do with these systems?
His idea, in one of these books from the 1970s, he launches the idea of convivial technologies. So again, he is no technophobe who wants to abolish all forms of technology. He's no Luddite or anything like that. He claims, well, we should think about a particular form of technology that respects some form of what he calls convivial autonomy. And basically, you can say that it respects three criteria. One is human collective independence. So what I was talking about with dating platforms like Tinder was an obvious case of dependency. If the only option to get or to find a romantic partner is through a privately owned company like Tinder, that's a clear case of dependency. So if we want to foster independence, then we need technologies that don't force their use upon us. And so you could have dating platforms where you have the platform, but there are also other options still left. And so you would still have the opportunity to flirt or find a romantic partner in an analog fashion. This independence also means that once we're on the platform, it isn't the platform that decides for us with whom we match or don't match. And so what I finished with the previous question was that, for instance, dating platforms reproduce inequalities. And so, for instance, there are studies that show that Black people have a smaller likelihood of finding matches on dating platforms because the only thing you are judged by is your picture. And if your picture is in some way presents something that is considered as socially undesirable, it means that your likelihood of finding a partner there gradually diminish. So you would need platforms where these kinds of tendencies are up to democratic decision making. So where it would be the users of the platform that actually decide what the rules of the game are. And so now we don't even know how platforms like social media or like dating platforms match people to each other, because all these algorithms are subject to intellectual property rights. So that's one part, independence. Another part is self-determination. So this technology should help us to expand our options and to grant us more freedom rather than make us dependent. That means that we have this democratic decision-making on these platforms, but also we should have the ability to make our own platforms as we wish. So for instance, in the case of work platforms like Deliveroo and Uber, there's a researcher named Trevor Schultz who argues for the spread of basic protocols that would be open access so that workers can create their own platforms for their particular business. So for instance, for food delivery, there's a company called Koopcycle, and basically they put their algorithms in open access. And then workers in particular cities could use this software to make their own platforms as cooperatives. So that's the idea of self-determination for workers here. And then the last element is that, you can have all the autonomy you want. So you can make your own decisions, but if those decisions don't matter, you won't invest in them. So for instance, I have the option to count all the trees in the garden, for instance, but that's not a choice that's relevant to me. I can't really find any meaning in that. That's a practice that doesn't resonate with me. And so it's this form of resonance that's also important for Illich in convivial technologies. They should provide some form of meaning to our lives. Imagine, for instance, the tools of a craftsman. These tools are technology, but technology that fosters the ability for that craftsman to create a meaningful life world for that person. And so we should think about digital platforms that can do the same. And you can definitely see potential in lots of these. For instance, social media. Social media does help to produce social connection or social relations. Imagine if we would have to withstand the corona pandemic without platforms like Facebook or Twitter or Zoom. It would have been next to impossible to do so. During these months or years, we've realized that you can foster some form of social connection that is meaningful to us through these digital tools. But the way in which it is organized now means that this form of resonance is gradually undermined. And so what starts, for instance, on social media as a way to find genuine connection to people turns into this addiction by design. So there is a potential there, but a potential left unrealized.
From Illich, we can conclude to a plea for platforms that are independent or organize a kind of collective independence, that are self-determined or create self-determination and resonance. And a final, also very important lesson to take home. The problem is not technology itself. It's not just these digital technologies, but the way how we organize these technologies. And Illich hopefully then provides us with a kind of alternative way of organizing them. Well, this was very interesting. Thank you, Tim, for explaining platform capitalism, its problems, and even providing us with a way out. We can all become a kind of Illichians and try to reorganize our platforms. It was very interesting. Thank you for being here, for explaining it to us, and maybe we'll see each other in a next episode.
Thank you. Bye.